What if the woman you saved from dying in the middle of the wilderness turned out to be the heiress of a forgotten fortress? He was a poor man with nothing but a kind heart, until one act of compassion pulled him into a world of power, betrayal, and destiny. Stay tuned, because what she gives him next will leave an entire kingdom in shock. The wind howled through the pine-covered hills as Eli trudged along the rocky trail, a makeshift sack of wild herbs slung over his back, boots worn thin and soles barely clinging to the leather. The sun dipped low, casting amber shadows across the ridges, and the air was beginning to turn sharp with evening cold. He lived simply, too simply for most. But he knew the forest better than any map ever drawn. He paused near a clearing, listening, not with his ears, but with instinct sharpened by hunger and survival. That's when he heard it. A scream, sharp, female, filled with panic, then silence. He dropped the sack and ran, through brambles, over stones, feet slicing through brush like a ghost, until he reached a narrow ravine. But I saw her. A woman collapsed in the underbrush, leg twisted, hands trembling, her face pale as bone, lips blue, eyes rolling back. Snakebite. Eli didn't hesitate. Not to wonder who she was, why she was here, what it might cost. He dropped to his knees beside her, saw the puncture on her calf. Oh, already swelling, skin burning purple. "You're gonna be all right," he muttered, more prayer than promise. He pulled his belt free, tied it tight above the bite, and without a second thought, pressed his mouth to the wound, spitting venom into the dust. He ripped leaves from his pouch. Yarrow, plantain. Mashed them in his palm, packed them around the wound, lifted her with arms that had carried firewood. Not strangers. She moaned faintly as he carried her through the dusk, her breath shallow, heartbeat fading. He whispered to her, though she didn't answer. "Stay with me. I don't know who you are, but I know you don't die here." By the time he reached his cabin, the stars had claimed the sky. He laid her gently on the cot, wrapped her in the only blanket he had, lit the small stove, and stayed awake all night beside her, wiping her brow, cooling her skin, whispering nonsense stories just to fill the silence. She didn't move, she didn't speak, but he never left her side, not once, not knowing that the girl whose life he fought for with bark and bone would soon change his own in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Morning crept into the cabin like a secret, casting golden light across the floorboards, warming the chilled air as Eli stirred from the chair beside the cot, his neck stiff, eyes heavy with exhaustion. But his first glance was not toward the fire or the window. It was toward her, the woman, still wrapped in the faded wool blanket, her breathing now steadier, lips no longer blue, the swelling in her leg beginning to ease from the herbs he had applied again and again through the night. He moved closer, careful not to startle her, and just as he reached for the damp cloth resting in the bowl of melted snow, her eyelids fluttered, slowly, weakly, and then they opened. Eyes the color of storm clouds blinked up at him, dazed, confused, afraid. Where am I?" she whispered, voice thin as a thread. Eli leaned down, soft and steady, the way you approach a wounded animal. "You're safe," he said gently. "You were bitten by a timber rattler. I found you in the ravine. You've been out for nearly a day." She tried to sit up but winced, falling back against the pillow. "Don't move too much yet," he said, standing to ladle water into a cracked tin cup. "Here, slowly." She drank, her hands shaking. He watched her with the quiet care of someone who expects nothing in return. She looked around the cabin, at bare walls, one shelf of dried roots and canned beans, a coat hanging by the door, a small window overlooking a frozen stream, and her brow furrowed. "Who are you?" she asked. "Name's Eli. Just a man who lives out here. Been here a few years. And you?" She hesitated, then said simply, "Celeste." She didn't offer more. Not where she came from. Not why she was hiking alone. Not how a woman wearing hiking boots worth more than Eli's yearly supplies ended up nearly dying in the woods. But he didn't push. He just nodded and said, "All right then, Celeste." You just focus on getting better. Over the next 2 days, she did, slowly. He fed her broth made from wild herbs and roots, placed hot stones near the cot to keep her warm, and gave her the last of his salt to ease the muscle spasms. She watched him with guarded eyes, confused by his silence, his gentleness, the way he never asked for anything. No questions, no favors, not even her last name. "Why did you help me?" she asked one evening as he patched the fire. He shrugged without looking up. "'Cause you were dying. And I was there. You don't know me," she said. "Doesn't matter," he replied. "People are people, even out here." She stared at him a long time after that, like she was trying to remember something the world had made her forget. On the third morning, a helicopter echoed in the distance. Her hand went to her pocket. A GPS beacon. She must have triggered it before she collapsed. Eli didn't react. He just helped her stand, gave her his arm, and walked her slowly outside as the wind from the blades kicked up snow and pine needles around them. She turned to him, hair whipping around her face, something like regret flickering in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, voice barely audible over the roar. "You saved my life." Eli nodded, stepping back. "Take care of yourself." She hesitated like she wanted to say more, but then she stepped into the helicopter, and in seconds, she was gone. Just a woman in the woods, just a man who helped her, just a moment, passing like wind. But what Eli didn't know was that Celeste wasn't just grateful. She was watching, and what she planned next would change his world forever. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. As the echo of the helicopter blades faded into the sky, and Eli stood alone in the clearing, the scent of exhaust still hanging in the air like a ghost, the snow settling once more over the path where her footprints had vanished. He watched the sky for a long time, not because he expected her to return, but because part of him couldn't believe she had been real. He turned back toward his cabin slowly, every step heavier than before, the silence now feeling deeper, sharper, as if something vital had been torn from it. Inside, her empty cot looked like a memory already, the blanket still creased where her body had lain, the tin cup still half full on the table. He didn't touch anything. He just sat down in the same wooden chair, stared at the fire, and let the minutes pass like falling ash. The days that followed were slower than usual. Eli hunted less, spoke to no one, and even avoided the occasional townsfolk who ventured near the woods for trade. He told himself it was just another day, just another stranger, that he had done what anyone decent would do. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had glimpsed something extraordinary, and now the world felt dimmer by comparison. He didn't know her name beyond Celeste, didn't know where she came from or what kind of life waited for her beyond the trees. But he knew in his bones she didn't belong to this world of rusted pans and splintered door frames. She had been out of place, and yet in those moments she was sick, scared, and silent. She had felt closer to him than anyone in years, and now she was gone. By the 5th day, the snow began to melt. Spring crept in slowly. First with dripping icicles, then with bird song. And Eli, out gathering wood, forced himself back into rhythm. He cleared traps, restocked dried roots, and mended his boots. The world didn't stop just because his thoughts did, but deep in the woods, near the ravine where he had found her, he stopped walking. Something caught his eye, a scrap of paper caught in a thorn bush. He reached for it, delicate, soft, scented faintly of something foreign. It was a page torn from a leather-bound journal. On it, a single line scrawled in ink, "You gave me my life. I intend to return the favor. No name, no mark, just that." Eli stared at it, stunned. How had it gotten there? Had she left it for him? Had someone else come back? But before he could answer those questions, the forest trembled with something new. The sound of engines, not old pickups, not hunters, but black vehicles, quiet, sleek, dangerous in their precision. Eli's grip tightened around the paper as the first car appeared through the trees. Men in tailored coats stepped out, eyes scanning, boots clean despite the mud. One of them approached him with calm authority. "Are you Mr. Eli Rivers?" Eli nodded slowly. Every instinct flaring, the man gave a shallow bow. "Miss Celeste requests your presence." Immediately, Eli blinked. What for? But the man didn't answer. He simply opened the door to a waiting vehicle, and as Eli stepped forward, paper still clutched in his calloused hand, he had no idea that the world he thought he'd lost had only just begun to reveal itself. The wheels of the black vehicle crunched over gravel that felt older than time, the path narrowing as mist rolled down the mountain like breath from a sleeping giant, and Eli sat in stunned silence, his hands clenched, his eyes locked on the growing silhouette ahead. A fortress, not a house, not a mansion, but a towering relic of stone and legend, its turrets piercing the sky, its gates forged from black iron etched with a crest he didn't recognize but instantly felt. As the vehicle slowed, torches flickered to life along the high walls like the place had been expecting him, the air thick with the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from power. The doors swung open before he knocked, not by servants, but by guards in tailored black, whose expressions gave nothing away. A woman with sharp eyes and a silver brooch stepped forward. "Mr. Eli Rivers, Miss Celeste requests your presence." Her voice was cool, practiced, and rehearsed. Eli said nothing, only followed, his boots echoing against stone floors as they entered a corridor so vast he thought it might stretch into another century. Paintings lined the walls. Men and women in armor, in crowns, in robes, eyes that watched him as if judging whether he belonged. Chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Every step forward felt like a lie being undone. And then, at the end of a long hall, 2 carved doors opened. And there she was, Celeste. Not broken, not weak, but reborn, standing near a roaring fire, dressed in a long navy coat with silver detailing, her hair pinned like a crown, her back straight, her presence electric. She turned slowly, and their eyes met, the forest still flickering in the space between them. "You look surprised," she said softly. Eli didn't speak. His throat was dry. "What is this place?" he asked finally, and his voice cracked under the weight of it. She stepped closer, the fire catching the edge of her coat. "This is Blackthorn Hold," she said, like it meant something sacred. "My family's legacy, my burden." Her voice was clear, her gaze unwavering. "I was never meant to inherit it. But after my father's passing, there was no one else. I ran from it, and nearly died because of it. You never told me." Eli said, "I couldn't." She answered, "I didn't want you to save a name. I wanted to know if someone could still save a person." He took a breath, still processing the weight of it all. "Why bring me here?" She didn't hesitate, because everything in this place is surrounded by people who want power, not purpose. You asked for nothing. You gave everything, and that is what makes you dangerous. In all the ways this place needs. She pulled something from a velvet pouch. A scroll, sealed in wax with the crest from the gate. "I want you here, by my side, not as a servant, not as a symbol, but as someone this fortress can trust when it forgets what loyalty means." Eli stared at it, at her, at the flames reflecting off stone and silver and skin, and for the first time, he didn't feel poor. He felt chosen. Eli stood frozen, the seal scroll heavy in his calloused hand, its wax crest still warm from Celeste's touch, but it was her eyes that held him. The same storm-gray eyes that had once flickered with fear on a forest floor now burned with purpose, certainty, and something else he couldn't name, something fierce and intimate that made the walls around them feel like they were closing in and expanding all at once. "I'm not meant for places like this," he said quietly, his voice low, rough, honest, the weight of his past pressing into every syllable. "I've spent my life patching broken boots, not standing beside royalty." Celeste stepped closer, the fire crackling behind her like applause that only he could hear, her gaze never leaving his. "Then maybe that's exactly why you're meant to be here," she said, and there was no softness in her tone now. Only conviction. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask what it would cost. You saw someone suffering and you acted. Do you know how rare that is in this world?" Eli looked down at the scroll, his thumb tracing the edges of the seal. "So, what is this A gift?" She shook her head slowly. "No, a request, an alliance, a chance to use your voice in a place that has forgotten how to listen." Behind her, the chamber stretched into darkness, tapestries fluttering gently in the cold air, a stained glass window casting fractured light across the floor where his boots had left muddy prints, a reminder of everything he wasn't. "And your people," he asked, "they'll never accept someone like me." "I didn't ask their permission," she replied. "I don't need their approval. I nearly died running from who I am. And in that moment, you didn't treat me like a title. You treated me like I mattered. That's the foundation I want to rebuild this place on." Eli looked up, eyes burning, not from pride, but from the ache of recognition, the dangerous swell of being seen after a lifetime of being invisible. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't imagined any of it. He'd done what was right when no one was watching. And now, the world was. He unrolled the scroll slowly, reading the lines not with greed but with disbelief. Full advisory access, decision-making power, land title options, not charity, not a favor, a position, a purpose. He looked at Celeste, who was waiting. Not with pressure, but with quiet hope. "And if I say yes?" he asked. She stepped closer, close enough that her breath warmed the space between them. "Then we begin. Together." He didn't nod, didn't shake her hand. He simply said, "Then let's begin." And the fire behind them roared higher, as if the fortress itself had finally exhaled. But the moment Eli stepped into the great hall beside Celeste, dressed in a tailored coat that still felt foreign on his shoulders, the whispers began. Soft at first, like dust shifting behind walls, then sharper, serpents in silk, men and women draped in legacy and entitlement, who saw his rough hands and quiet eyes and immediately judged him unworthy. The courtiers didn't speak to him directly, but their glances said everything. Raised brows, concealed smirks, half nods that acknowledged his presence like one would acknowledge the help. At the council table, he was given a chair, technically equal, practically dismissed. They let him speak but rarely listened, nodding with a kind of politeness that stings worse than scorn. And when he offered practical solutions grounded in common sense and compassion, they smiled like he was a child reciting lines he didn't understand. Celeste stood by him publicly, fiercely, her voice firm every time someone questioned his place. But Eli could feel the storm brewing beneath the stone. Resentment from those who saw his presence as an infection in their bloodline, a crack in the ancient marble of their influence. Then came the invitation, a private hunting weekend arranged by Lord Whitcomb, one of Celeste's oldest advisors, although a man with a jaw carved from pride and eyes that held ice even when he smiled. Tradition, he said, a chance for the young heir and her new ally to bond with the inner circle. Celeste was hesitant, but Eli accepted, sensing the challenge in disguise. The estate was deep in the mountains, a place where bloodlines once hunted wolves and bragged about it over brandy. And from the moment Eli arrived, he knew what it was. This wasn't bonding. This was bait. They mocked his aim, offered him ill-fitting boots, served rare meats, and laughed when he hesitated. One night, over firelight and fine scotch, Whitcomb leaned in and said, "You know, Eli, a man like you might find more comfort with a shovel than a sword." Eli didn't rise. He didn't break. He simply stared across the flames and said, "And a man like you might learn something if he listened with his ears instead of his blood." The laughter stopped. Whitcomb's eyes narrowed. No more games. The next morning, they staged it. Oh, a misfire during the hunt. A slip on wet rock that sent Eli sliding toward a cliff's edge. It was deliberate, masked as an accident, and Eli saw it in the way no one rushed to help. But he didn't fall. He gripped a jutting branch, hauled himself back, and walked into camp bleeding from the palms, silent, calm, unshaken. He said nothing. Not then, not during the ride back, but when he returned to Blackthorn, Celeste met him at the gates, worry carved into her face. "I heard," she said, and he could tell she had already fired half the staff. Eli didn't ask for vengeance. He only said, "Now I know who I'm really standing beside." And from that moment on, the boy from the forest was no longer a question in the fortress. He was a reckoning. Tensions rose within Blackthorn like a storm gathering behind stained glass windows. And though the halls remained polished and the rituals unchanged, there was a quiet fracture running beneath the marble. A split between those who saw Eli as a symbol of rebirth and those who saw him as a threat to lineage, legacy, and control. Celeste stood taller beside him now, not because she needed protection, but because she had chosen alignment. Her presence beside Eli sending a message that echoed louder than any decree this man belonged. Yet behind every toast, every forced smile, every ceremonial dinner, eyes watched, waiting for him to falter, for his kindness to waver, for the illusion, as they saw it, to finally crack. Then it happened. During a public tour through the fortress for visiting diplomats and press, Celeste insisted on personally guiding a group through the eastern ramparts, a rarely opened wing with centuries of history sealed behind iron and glass. Eli was meant to be with her, as always, but a last-minute council distraction pulled him away. One he now believed had been engineered. As Celeste entered the stone corridor, the press and aides trailing behind her, a sudden shriek echoed down the hall. Then chaos. Lights flickered, security was scattered, and Eli, hearing the commotion from across the estate, ran. He reached the corridor just as Celeste collapsed to the ground, one hand clutching her shoulder, a fine dart lodged in her coat, guards yelling over each other, people scattering like leaves in a windstorm. Eli didn't stop to think. He dropped beside her, tore the fabric open, assessed the wound, then carried her into the nearest chamber, bolting the door behind him. Ignoring the flash of cameras and the protests of protocol. Poison, he muttered, recognizing the signs. Rapid pulse, glazed eyes, muscles beginning to spasm. Without hesitation, he reached into the satchel he never stopped carrying, pulled out a crushed vial of woodland root, and mixed it with water from a ceremonial basin. She could barely speak. But when their eyes locked, hers were filled not with fear, but with something far deeper, trust. He held the mixture to her lips, supporting her head with one arm, speaking gently, steadily, like he had the first night in the forest. Stay with me, Cell. I've got you. I've always got you. Within hours, her fever broke. She would live, but the attempt, captured on half a dozen news cameras, had done something no bloodline could undo. It showed the world that when power was under attack, it wasn't a duke or a general who saved the heir of Blackthorn. It was a man with nothing but a steady hand, ancient knowledge, and a heart too stubborn to let go. Headlines blazed across screens, "Who is Eli Rivers, the poor man who saved a kingdom?" Twice, public opinion shifted like a tide no council could stop. Eli was no longer a curiosity. He was a symbol. And the ones who had plotted in the shadows felt the fortress turn against them. Not by decree, but by the will of the people. They had tried to erase him, but instead, they had carved his name into stone. The days that followed were quiet only on the surface. The halls of Blackthorn scrubbed clean of the chaos. The guests dismissed. The staff rotated. And the council seated with frozen smiles that no longer reached their eyes. But beneath the calm was a tension sharp enough to shatter glass. Celeste recovered quickly, her body weakened but her fire unshaken, and every time Eli entered the room, she turned toward him like a compass snapping north. Not out of obligation, not out of romance, but out of something stronger, forged in fire and venom and choices made when no one else dared act. She had always been noble by name, but now she stood crowned by gratitude. And Eli, once merely the man who helped her breathe again, had become the fortress's pulse. Quiet, vital, impossible to remove without killing the heart of the place. But power rarely dies quietly. The old guard did not protest openly. They knew better now, but they maneuvered in whispers, in backroom conversations, in subtle insinuations spread to the outer villages. He's not one of us. He's untrained, dangerous, unfit to advise a bloodline. Rumors swirled like smoke in stone corridors. Yet for every whisper, there came a louder echo. Villagers who remembered Eli's name from the headlines. Travelers who came bearing gifts for the man who had saved their heiress. Children who asked if he'd always been brave. And then came the letter, delivered in secret by a trembling steward, addressed not to Celeste, but to Eli. A request for a meeting, signed by the High Chancellor of the Northern Holdings. Not an invitation, a plea. Their winter province had fallen into unrest, their fields frozen, their guards corrupt, and their council, bloated with titles, refused to listen to the cries of the people. We heard of what you did. The letter read, not just the saving, but the staying. We do not need another noble. We need someone real. Celeste read the letter beside him, her hand brushing his as her eyes searched his face. They don't ask this of nobles, she said softly. They ask it of legends. I'm not a legend, Eli replied. I'm just someone who stayed when it mattered. She smiled. Exactly. And so he went, not in the ceremony, not in robes, but on horseback, with dust in his wake and fire in his eyes, flanked by guards who once mocked him, but now rode at his side in silence. He met the suffering not with speeches, but with presence. He listened. He acted. He walked the frozen fields himself, spoke to the children, sat in cold halls with the frightened and angry and exhausted, until the unrest melted into something more human. Hope. And when he returned to Blackthorn weeks later, there were no trumpets, but the villagers lined the road, and Celeste waited at the gates, not as a ruler above him, but as an equal beside him. The boy from the woods hadn't just been accepted, he had been trusted, and trust, once earned, cannot be undone. Spring came like a quiet promise, unfolding across the stone courtyards of Blackthorn in bursts of green ivy and gold-tipped blossoms, the fortress softening at the edges as if it, too, had begun to breathe again after centuries of holding itself too tightly. And in the center of it all stood Eli. No longer an outsider, no longer a question mark, but a presence rooted deeper than tradition. His name spoken not with skepticism, but with reverence. The villagers bowing, not because of fear, but because of what he had come to mean. He had walked into fire, into frost, into silence, and answered every trial, not with arrogance, but with quiet strength. And the fortress had changed because of it. Celeste watched him now, the way a flame watches its source. Not just with admiration, but with need, with understanding, with a connection forged so deeply that neither could remember where it began. And so, when the anniversary of her father's death approached, a ceremony of legacy and lineage, a night when every noble house arrived dressed in gold and judgment, it was Celeste who made the decision no one expected. She stood at the head of the great hall, her gown dark as midnight, crown of silver thorns resting on her brow, eyes scanning the room filled with faces that had once doubted, once whispered, once schemed, and then, without preamble, without warning, she spoke. Tonight is about memory, but I've chosen to build more than a memory. I've chosen to build a future. The crowd stilled, the air tightening. There is a man among us who was never meant to sit at this table, not by blood, not by title, but by action, by loyalty, by sacrifice. He has shown more nobility than any name ever carried. She turned then, holding out her hand. Eli, gasps rose like a wind through the chamber as he stepped forward, not in royal silk, but in the coat he'd worn when he first walked these halls. Simple, strong, unchanged. He didn't bow, he didn't speak, he simply took her hand, and Celeste, without breaking her gaze, knelt. Gasps became silence. I offer you not a throne, she said, voice ringing like iron through the chamber, but a life beside me, as my equal, as the keeper of this hold, as the keeper of my heart. The silence cracked into thunderous applause. Not from the nobles, but from the people watching beyond the balcony, from the guards along the walls, from the staff who had seen them both at their worst, and now witnessed them at their best. Eli leaned down, lifted her hand, and kissed it. Not as a ruler, but as a man who had once chosen to save a life without knowing it would become his own. And somewhere in the rafters, the wind shifted, and the old banners of Blackthorn didn't just wave, they bowed. They married at dawn, not under vaulted ceilings or before rows of nobility, but in the quiet sanctuary of the fortress gardens, where the first light spilled through ivy-covered stone, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. There were no trumpets, no fanfare, only a handful of witnesses. Guards who had once doubted, villagers who now called his name with pride, and the ancient trees that had stood long before any crown. Celeste wore a gown of silver thread, delicate and strong, her hair braided with wildflowers from the ravine where their story began. Eli wore the same boots he had knelt in when he first pulled her from the edge of death, the same hands that had trembled while feeding her broth, now steady as he took hers in his. When she whispered her vows, she didn't speak of lineage or power. She spoke of the night he stayed by her side when the world had turned its back, of the way he looked at her without fear or flattery, of how he reminded her not of royalty, but of humanity. And when Eli answered, his voice low and unshakable, he didn't speak of her title or her wealth. He said only, "I loved you before I knew your name, and I will love you long after mine is forgotten." The sun broke fully then, casting light over the fortress like a blessing, like a signal to the world that something old had ended and something timeless had begun. Later that evening, long after the small celebration had faded into laughter and soft music, Eli stood on the balcony of Blackthorn Hold, overlooking the land that now stretched before him, not as a stranger, but as its steward. Celeste joined him, barefoot, leaning into his side as the sky turned to fire. "You changed everything," she said softly. He shook his head. "No," he murmured, "you changed everything. I just didn't let you fall." She smiled, her fingers lacing through his. "Then let's never let anyone fall alone again." And so, the poor man who once lived in silence beneath the trees, who gave everything for nothing, who asked for no reward but earned a kingdom, became more than a legend. He became the reason the fortress lived again, and etched into the stone arch above Blackthorn's gates, newly carved and gilded by the people, were the words that would echo for generations. Greatness is not inherited. It is revealed, when we choose to save, not rule.